Hello. I feel it's only right I should tell you I have no jokes. You can just all prepare to be very, very unhappy for 15 minutes, which is kind of my speciality. I don't know how to put that in, so I'm just going to hold it. So this is my book, Lowborn. Like Keith, and I thought everyone's been a beautiful speaker, but Keith especially resonated with me because I really believe that stories can change things. For me, that's always been about exposing the divisions that poverty can create, whether that's individually or in a community or in a society as a whole. And that is why I decided to write this, frankly, startlingly personal book, Lowborn. I'm going to read you a little bit from a BBC Radio 4 adaptation of this book. I'm not brave enough to go off script, so please forgive me. Shall we start with a happy ending? I made it. I rose. I escaped poverty. I escaped bad food because that's all you can afford. I escaped threadbare clothes and too tight shoes. I escaped drinking or drugging myself into oblivion because I probably escaped early mortality rates and preventable diseases. We'll see. I escaped obesity. I escaped the higher rate of preventable diseases. I escaped sink estates, burnt-out houses, and ice cream vans selling drugs at the school gates. I escaped casual, grim violence fueled by frustration and extra strong lager. I escaped welfare queues and means assessments and shitty zero-hour jobs. I escaped hopelessness. I lived more of that life, my first 20 years, than I've lived of this infinitely cushier one since. And the degrading names for poor people still ring in my head every day. Chav, that's a special UK one. Scav, which is short for scavenger. Lowlife. Ned, which stands for non-educated delinquent. Underclass. Lowborn. Yes, I might have been lowborn, but somehow I ascended. I reached up high enough to write these words and believe someone might read them. Now I eat well and I always have somewhere decent to stay. My clothes are cheap, but I can afford to replace them. I enjoy the luxury of exercise. I heat my flat in the winter. I have access to art, music, film, and books, and they don't feel like a foolishness. When I've been unwell in mind or body, I've sought help, it's been given, and I've got better. I've traveled the world several times over and made a living doing what I love, which is very much the preserve of people not like me. Now, let's go back to the beginning. One single mother, 2 stays in foster care, 9 primary schools, 1 sexual abuse child protection inquiry, 5 high schools, but no graduation, 2 sexual assaults, 1 rape, 2 abortions, my 18th birthday. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire asks 10 questions to measure childhood trauma, and each affirmative answer gives you a point. Research has shown that an individual with an ASCII score of 4 or higher is 260% more likely to have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease than someone with a score of 0. 240% more likely to contract hepatitis, 460% more likely to experience depression, and 1,220% more likely to attempt suicide. I scored 8. It might be easier to believe I was somehow unlucky. Certainly a lot of politicians in our country would like you to believe that I was somehow a terrible exception. But the truth is, the people I grew up with experienced much of the same, a little less sometimes, often a lot more. The difference for me, I saw something on the horizon and I ran. I am proudly working class, and in this socially mobile hinterland I currently occupy, which is neither here, certainly, and neither back there, I miss the sense of community that tribe might provide me. But I was never proudly poor. True poverty is grinding, all-encompassing, and often dehumanizing. I think it goes without saying that the knowing shame of poverty is something I have never missed, especially because I still frequently experience its aftershocks. I've come to believe that being born poor is not simply a matter of economics or situation. It is a psychology and an identity all of its own that in me has endured long beyond my escape. A year ago, I decided to go back to Scotland, where I was born, and follow the staggering itinerant route of my childhood down the country to the poor towns I lived in. Not so different from my ancestors chasing herring, silver darling down the line of the coast, but I would be casting my net for facts and truths, and I'd cut them open and see what the guts told me. Did those towns die with the decline of their traditional industries? What was it like to be poor and working class living there now? What did working class even mean anymore? As I went up and down the country, I'd retrace my own childhood and try to fill the gaping holes in my memory. I decided to seek answers to my questions because now I believed I could open my mouth to ask and not be punched or punished or ridiculed. When every day of your life you have been told you are worth nothing, can you ever escape that sense of being lowborn, no matter how far you've come? My mum was 20 when she met my dad. She'd left Scotland at 16 with no qualifications, then travelled about the UK working as a waitress, spending her spare time and her tips at discotheques. Everything I knew about Mum, I learned from the stories she told me herself. In the course of writing this book, I would learn more, perhaps more than I'd wished to. But when I was a child, she told me how she loved dancing. She adored Blondie, Bowie, and Leonard Cohen, and reminiscing about a particular sheer sparkling silver dress she'd wear to nightclubs in London, and how everyone would watch her as she walked to the bar. She had a huge laugh, as all the women in her family do, bellying and dirty and full of irrepressible life, no matter how hard life tried to repress her. But she was also extremely, possibly irretrievably vulnerable and fractured, and extraordinarily naive. She was proud of her tough working class heritage and was a feminist before she knew the word. She had been, one relative told me, a shy and giggly teen, but then she went to London and found her confidence away from her mother, my grandmother, who she had a very difficult relationship with. She had certain absolutely unyielding moral values. Women weren't lesser than men. You should never, ever be racist. Never kick a dog when it's down. My father was 42 when he met my mother, and he was not yet a diagnosed schizophrenic or Valium addict, but he was receiving a pension from the US Army after a breakdown during basic training 26 years before, and was already in the grip of alcoholism. At 16, he'd gone straight into the army, but then he'd had his nervous breakdown and ended up spending 3 years, maybe more, in a German mental hospital. Dad had an unpredictable relationship with the truth, but I will tell you anyway the stories he told me about where he came from. After discharge, he told me, he returned to California, went briefly to UCLA but never graduated, worked as a mailman, got married to a beautiful Japanese woman who broke his heart, got scouted by a model agency, and then washed up in London. Whether that's true, guys, I literally have no idea. They can't have been together more than a few months. My mum always used to talk about that time, her last burst of freedom before me. She told me they drank Brandy Alexander cocktails, lived in a squat, and embraced the party atmosphere of the late 70s. When my mum told my dad, twice her age, that she was pregnant, he fell to his knees and cried, "What am I going to do?" And my mum broke up with him and booked an appointment for the abortion clinic. She was 20, vulnerable and jobless, and I don't doubt an abortion would have been the best thing for her. She told me several times each year how she was on the metro to the clinic and then changed her mind. I don't think she was telling that story to be cruel. I believe she was trying to tell me she'd chosen me, that I'd been an accident, but then I'd been a decision. But she also told me that though she loved me, having me had meant she had sacrificed her whole life. And so she traveled to Scotland, to a place she'd never wanted to return to her mother, the very picture of a working class matriarch. My grandma was the most terrifying woman I've ever known. She could be charming, loving even, but if crossed, you'd see her become very still. Her speech would slow, her manicured finger would point towards you, eyes like ice. She spent her whole life in the fish factories like every woman before her in the family. It is a job of brutal conditions and vicious workplace politics. She told me all the time, don't let the dogs get you down. She told me to always stick up for myself. She told me to grab the hair first in fights, to use my nails. With no other options, my pregnant mum moved back in with grandma and started work in a fish factory as a packer. I've often imagined the heavy apron over her swollen belly, the metallic-smelling mix of sea and blood. She told me how Fridays on payday she'd go to town and buy a little thing from the baby shop, a baby grow, perhaps a bottle. My mum and grandma were watching The House That Dripped Blood when 2 weeks late I demanded release. My mum refused to go to hospital until the end of the film, and I can conjure her there, sitting grim-faced, gripping the arms of grandma's old mint velvet sofa, probably smoking a cigarette, refusing to accept that her life was about to change. They called me Kerrygold after a brand of British butter because my grandmother held me and said, what a beautiful little pound of Kerrygold butter. It's hard enough to imagine how those two strong, complex women with their history of rows had managed stewing away in that tiny apartment. But for one reason and another, my mum and I ended up living in a women's refuge for battered women. Mum always spoke about it fondly, as though we'd been on a holiday. And I can see how it might have felt like that for her, the emotional and practical support, a community of women who understood what it was to be beaten down and to be tired and still wake up fighting every single day. There's only one photo of me during that time. Chubby and naked, I lie on a white mat covered with orange flowers. I was a surprisingly fat baby, my arms and legs raised, looking away from the camera. I used to take out that picture a lot when I was a kid, trying to work out how much of me was in that baby, or perhaps enjoying the sight of that tot who didn't know what lay ahead. Whenever I think about myself brand new, I think about those sepia colors, and I see that fat little baby who didn't want to show her face to the camera. That's been your 15 minutes depression by me, Kerry Hudson. But since Madlova. The bar still is open. And just to say, if you want to hear the rest, you can go to BBC4 and you can hear the other 4 episodes if you feel like being really depressed.